Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mindset Forge, a podcast where we discuss the best ideas of humanity, the most useful practices, and the most skillful means for developing a more well-adjusted and adaptive mindset. To do this, I will be discussing latest science, ancient philosophy that has stood the test of time, as well as the thoughts and actions of important historical paragons. The goal is to give you tools and practices and ideas for your self-improvement with the goal of moving ahead the entire humanity. Our discussion will focus on the ideas and practices with the most cash value, so practices that are easy to take up but hold enormous potential. And since most of these practices have to do with changing your thinking and attitudes, they are completely free. Call me Laurent Lohel, I will be your host, and welcome aboard. Also, make sure to like Mindset Forge on Spotify and YouTube, as well as check out our Discord server, where you can find links to my book, which you can buy on Amazon to support my another side enterprise of being a fiction author. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. Mindset Forge, episode 6. Perceptions. More adaptive ways to see the world and ourselves. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. The original source of this quote is unknown. The word perception means the organization, identification, and interpretation of sensory information in order to represent and understand the presented information or environment. The key thing to note here is that perception is more complicated than just a sense being directly translated into information. For example, light hits the retina and an image is eventually formed. But like we have mentioned in previous episodes, and like we will further explain in this episode, the perception that is created in our mind is not necessarily an objective recreation of outside world, and even if it was, it almost immediately gets linked to various judgments in our brain. This process is influenced by many things, like our preconceptions, attitudes, and mood, so things related to our mindset. In this episode, we will learn more about how perception is formed in our minds and how to use this to our advantage. Like the episode on the self before, this episode aims to shake your deeply held views. This time, instead of dismantling yourself, we will continue dismantling the world around us, or at least our perception of it. Most people consider the world around them to be as is. Things are like they appear, but that is not, strictly speaking, the case. Just like the case with the self, the world around us is also an illusion. And I am not speaking in parable here, or describing some esoteric mystical view. I am saying that according to reputable peer-reviewed Western science, the world is not like it appears to us. So, in other words, it is an illusion. Again, there would be little point in deliberating about the reality and objectivity of anything if it did not have practical consequences. Once our perceptions about our surroundings as well as ourselves are understood to be illusions, great benefit can immediately be gleaned. Seeing behind the illusion, you see much more and more clearly and truthfully. We will also discuss what kinds of benefits can be achieved with the use of our senses and other interesting related subjects. for even more practical benefit. This time I would like to open up with a real-world example that I find very thought-provoking and motivational, even though the event itself is very dark and tragic. Call this Exhibit A. That is the example of a Buddhist monk, and pardon my Vietnamese, Thich Quang Duc. You may not recall his name, but you have probably seen a picture of him. Thich Quang Duc was a Vietnamese Buddhist monk born in 1897, who became a symbol of protests against the persecution of Buddhists in South Vietnam. The Diem regime, led by President Ngo Dinh Diem, a devout Catholic, imposed oppressive policies that discriminated against and persecuted the majority Buddhist population of South Vietnam. The government favored Catholics, providing them with better access to resources, education, and career opportunities. Buddhists, on the other hand, faced severe restrictions on their religious practices, including a ban on flying the Buddhist flag and restrictions on celebrating important Buddhist holidays. Additionally, the regime used brutal tactics to silence dissent, including arrests, forced conversions, and destruction of Buddhist temples, and even the execution of monks and nuns. These harsh measures created a deep sense of resentment among the Buddhist community, ultimately leading to widespread protests and acts of resistance, such as the self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc in June of 1963, amid increasing tensions between the predominantly Buddhist population and the government led by President Ngo Dinh Diem. Thich Quang Duc took a bold and dramatic stand. On June 11, 1963, Thich Quang Duc, accompanied by fellow monks and nuns, arrived at a busy intersection in Saigon. There, he calmly sat down in the lotus position and, after having gasoline poured over his body, he set himself on fire. This shocking act of self-immolation was not only a form of protest, but also a demonstration of the power of deep meditation and a focused mindset. As the flames engulfed him, Thich Quang Duc remained remarkably still, showing no signs of pain or distress. This powerful image was captured in photographs and video footage that circulated worldwide, generating a strong reaction and raising awareness about the plight of Buddhists in Vietnam. The self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc had a profound impact on both the national and international stage. It led to widespread outrage and put immense pressure on the Diem regime. As a result, President Kennedy even began reconsidering his support for the Diem government. Though the situation in Vietnam did not improve immediately, Thich Quang Duc's self-sacrifice remains a symbol of the power of the human mind and the strength of one's convictions. Now, I don't recommend anyone set themselves on fire for any reason, but his example really makes one question one's limits, as well as the limits of human beings in general. I do not look up to him because he burned himself to death. What I find remarkable is that he showed absolutely no reaction to the flames, even when they consumed his body. The Buddha, in a famous speech called the Fire Sermon, said that the reason why we suffer is that, I quote, all is flame, saying, and I quote, monks, all is burning. And what, monks, is the all that is burning? The eye is burning, forms are burning, eye consciousness is burning, eye contact is burning, and whatever feeling arises with eye contact as condition, whether pleasant or painful or neither painful nor pleasant, that too is burning. Burning with what? burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of delusion, burning with birth, aging and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure and despair, I say." End quote. He then explains that the fire that burns us so are the grasping, aversion and delusions, as well as sorrows that we generate from our perceptions. He told his monks that by letting go of grasping, aversion and so on, one could be freed from this burning, linking perceptions to human suffering as well as the release thereof. As a Buddhist monk, Guang Duk must have been well versed in these teachings. But this episode is not about the Buddha's teachings, it is about perception. Exhibit B. If you follow any kinds of news, from mainstream to social media, you have probably heard how stress is the affliction of our time. Stress can lead to depression and anxiety and burnout, which in turn lead to people dropping out of school or taking sick leave from work. I think I will have an episode specifically on stress in the future, but I have wanted to make this point for a while now, so here goes. How can somebody find going to school or work too taxing, too painful, when another person is capable of burning themselves to death without flinching? I don't know about you, but to me that tells that the problem is not the school or the employment or the outside world in general, but how we perceive it. By developing our minds with practice and letting go of maladaptive mindsets, that is, ideas and beliefs that only cause us harm, we can change ourselves so we can take much more than before, much more than we thought possible, and even rejoice while doing so. We have the capacity to be as unshakable as Thich Guang Duk. We have discussed things that affect perceived pain, but I'm sure we can find some more. But let us first lay out how perception is created by our bodies, by our sense organs, nerves and central nervous system. A perception is a complex process that involves the transformation of sensory input into meaningful information about the world around us. It is a multi-stage process that begins when our sense organs detect stimuli and ends when our brain interprets these signals, ultimately creating our subjective experience of reality. Stage 1. Sensation. The process begins when our sense organs, such as our eyes, ears, skin, nose and tongue, detect external stimuli like light, sound, pressure, odor and taste. Specialized sensory receptor cells convert these stimuli into electrical signals, a process called transduction. Stage 2. Transmission. The electrical signals or nerve impulses generated by sensory receptors are transmitted along neural pathways to the brain. These pathways are made up of neurons which communicate with each other through synapses, where neurotransmitters facilitate the transmission of signals. Stage 3. Processing. The brain processes the incoming signals, integrating and organizing the information received from multiple senses. This involves a series of hierarchical processing steps where simpler features are combined to form more complex representations. For instance, in visual processing, the brain first detects edges and colors before recognizing more complex shapes and objects. Stage 4. Interpretation. The processed sensory information is then interpreted in the context of our past experiences, knowledge and expectations. This stage is influenced by various cognitive factors such as attention, memory and emotion, which can shape the final perception. The final perception that enters our conscious mind is a result of this dynamic interplay between bottom-up sensory processing and top-down cognitive influences, which makes our perceptions unique and subjective. The data gathered by our sense organs is influenced every step of the way. In Stage 1 sensation, Retinal processing, as mentioned earlier, emphasizes certain features while suppressing others. For example, retinal processing, as mentioned earlier, emphasizes certain features while suppressing others. For example, the center-surround organization of retinal ganglion cells enhances the perception of edges and contrast. This organization causes a cell to respond more strongly to differences in light intensity between its center and the surrounding region, helping our visual system to detect edges more effectively. Stage 2. Transmission. Neuroplasticity plays a significant role in perception as it allows the brain to adapt to new experiences and environments. For instance, studies on blind individuals have shown that the primary visual cortex, which is typically responsible for processing visual information, can be repurposed for processing auditory or tactile information. This cross-modal plasticity enables blind individuals to develop enhanced auditory or tactile abilities, such as heightened sensitivity to sound localization or fine touch discrimination. Stage 3. Processing. Top-down processing driven by higher cognitive functions can influence the processing of sensory signals. For example, in the phenomenon of perceptual set, our expectations and prior knowledge can predispose us to perceive certain aspects of a stimulus while ignoring others. A classic demonstration of this is the old woman/young woman ambiguous figure, where our prior knowledge or expectation determines which interpretation of the figure we perceive, meaning that if you have been told that you are going to see an image of a young woman, that is what you are going to see, and the same goes if you expect an image of an old woman. If you are unfamiliar with this illusion, search for it in the search engine of your choice. Similarly, attention plays a crucial role in processing. When we focus our attention on specific aspects of a stimulus, the neural responses related to those aspects are enhanced, making the attended features more salient in our perception. Stage 4. Interpretation. Our past experiences, knowledge and expectations can shape how we interpret sensory information. For example, cultural differences have been shown to influence the interpretation of facial expressions. In a study by Matsumoto and Ekman in 1989, participants from different cultures were asked to judge the emotions displayed in a set of facial expressions. While there was a general agreement across cultures for the basic emotions, some variations in the interpretations were observed, reflecting cultural influences on the perception of emotions. Now you have a rough image of how perception is formed and how the process is not just a passive tube of objective data flowing into your brain. Let us look into some illusions and other curiosities that show how our perceptions are not to be trusted. We'll begin by exploring a well-known yet fascinating aspect of our visual perception: visual blind spots. A blind spot is an area in your visual field where you cannot perceive anything because there is lack of light-sensitive photoreceptor cells in the optic disc, the spot where the optic nerve connects to the retina in the back of your eye. The reason for this blind spot is that the optic nerve, which transmits visual information to the brain, needs to pass through the retina. This creates a small area with no photoreceptors, and thus no visual information can be gathered from this specific region. You can easily check this for yourself. I just put the words blind spot test into a web search engine, and the first result took me to a page with a black dot and a cross on a white page where I could test my blind spot in less than a minute. If you are a computer, you can do the same. And this demonstration highlights a fascinating aspect of our perception. Even though we have these blind spots in our visual field, we don't usually notice them. And this is because our brain compensates for the missing information by filling in the gaps based on the surrounding context, patterns and colors. It's a remarkable example of how our brain constructs our perception, often relying on guesswork and predictions to create a seamless and complete visual experience. Visual blind spots remind us that our perceptions are not always an accurate representation of reality. Instead, they are heavily influenced and constructed by our brain's interpretation of the sensory input it receives. It is also the most benign way our brain adds something extra to our perception that I know of. Other additions, if we are not aware of them and take them for granted, are the source of all our problems, the flames the Buddha talked about. Another example having to do with our visual system are saccades. Saccades are rapid eye movements that occur when we shift our gaze from one point to another. During these quick movements, our visual system effectively turns off, causing a brief period of blindness known as saccadic suppression. This phenomenon is essential for maintaining a stable and clear visual experience, as it prevents us from perceiving the blurred images that would result from our eyes moving rapidly across the visual field. Despite being momentarily blind during saccades, we remain unaware of these gaps in our visual perception. This is due to a phenomenon called chronostasis, or the stopped clock illusion. Our brain essentially fills in the missing information during saccades by extending the perception of the image we see right before the saccade. It then adjusts our perception of time so we don't notice the brief moment of blindness. To understand this better, consider the example of looking at the clock with a ticking second hand. If you quickly shift your gaze to the clock, you might perceive the second hand as appearing to be momentarily stationary before it starts moving again. This illusion occurs because your brain fills in the missing information during the saccade, making it seem as though the second hand has been in that position for a slightly longer duration. This mechanism of saccadic suppression and chronostasis illustrates the remarkable ability of our brain to create a continuous and stable visual experience, even though our perception is periodically interrupted by brief moments of blindness. It's yet another example of how our brain actively constructs our perceptions, compensating for limitations in our sensory input to maintain a coherent and consistent representation of the world around us. We feel like we see things continuously, even when we are blind every time we swivel our eyes one way or the other. Again, our brain is adding to our perception things without our knowledge. Another case in point are optical illusions. I see little point in going into a lot of detail over visual subject in a podcast with no video feed, so again you can easily turn to the web search engine of your choice. Check out Muller-Lyer illusion as well as Ponceau illusion. Those are Muller-Lyer illusion as well as Ponzo illusion, as well as the search optical illusion in general to find more. Be warned, these might cause a headache or some type of existential crisis. One of these illusions is the old woman / young woman illusion we mentioned earlier, which we use to illustrate how our expectations direct the way we see things. What we see in the image is guided by what we have been told we are going to see. Inattentional blindness is another related subject. Inattentional blindness occurs when an individual fails to perceive an unexpected stimulus that is in plain sight because their attention is focused elsewhere. The famous invisible gorilla experiment is an example of this phenomenon, where participants focusing on counting basketball passes failed to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. In this case, we are supposed to count the basketball passes like we have been told to, and are blind to the roaming primate. There are enough different kinds of sensory illusions to fill an entire episode, but to go through them all is not my intention. I think the examples provided are enough to make anyone agree that our senses do not relay information impartially, accurately, and objectively, but have design flaws and features that cause imperfections in the sensations, while our brains meddle with the end product without our knowledge. This next quote by William James will serve to lead us into the next segment of our discussion. Whilst part of what we perceive comes through our senses from the object before us, a part, and it may be the larger part, always comes out of our own head. If asked what affects a given perception, for example a sight or a sound, I think most would answer something like how bright it is or how loud it is. But how many would have offered my mood? Let us turn our attention towards these inside factors that influence the way we see the outside. A major theme of this podcast are goals, and that is why we have devoted so much time to goal setting in an earlier episode. As it turns out, having a goal or a motivation influences the way you perceive the world around you. Researchers Emily Balcetis and David Dunning discuss this in their paper See What You Want to See: Motivational Influences on Visual Perception, in which they proved that when people were shown ambiguous figures, meaning images that could be interpreted in at least two ways, people saw the image that would benefit them, which in this study was the thought of getting to drink fresh orange juice over a foul and gelatinous concoction. Further exams ruled out possibility of foul play on the subject's part, as even their unconscious responses showed that they perceived what they hoped to see. This has been replicated in other studies. For example, they saw a group of dots moving in a direction that would earn them a reward when the actual direction of the dots was difficult to discern. It has also been shown that goal instrumental objects appear larger in our visual fields than they should. In the previous episode, we discussed a study where it was shown that being in poor physical shape makes hills appear steeper. There's also a study which brings motivation into the mix from the year 2012, with Emily Balcetis again as one of the main authors. The authors set out to study how one's physical fitness, or physiological potential as they put it, affects the way they see the world when it comes to their goals. Most people want to improve their health and know that losing excess weight would help, but never seem to do so. The authors propose that part of the reason is that they simply perceive the world as less accessible as those in better shape, which makes it more difficult for them to start improving their fitness. In this study, it was shown that people with low motivation and low physical fitness overestimated how long it was to the finish line. In their eyes, the distance appeared greater and thus more laborious. Having strong motivation, on the other hand, made the distance appear shorter, even for those in poor shape. Among subjects in good physical shape, the motivation did not matter on the accuracy of their perception, which I count as another win for being in good physical shape. These people in low motivation and poor fitness group, in my view, would benefit from cognitive reappraisal. If their goal is to get in shape, it is actually better if the surroundings are demanding. If they manage their views and mindsets, they could possibly change this limiting factor that is binding them to their sofas into something that motivates them ahead. But what if this person still can't motivate themselves to get over the obstacle of the running track that appears never ending, or the hill that could as well be Mount Everest? Researchers has shown that approaching the challenge with a close friend eliminates the perceived extra steepness. And even if one has poor physical shape, no motivation, and no friends to take along, don't worry. Research has shown that self-affirmation also removes the added extra difficulty from our perception. In the study I read, this was accomplished by people writing an essay about their highest ranked value before estimating the distance to a landmark while wearing a heavy backpack. So self-affirmation negated our mind's penchant for perceiving walking distances as longer when carrying along extra weight. Another ongoing theme in this podcast is mood. I hope that by bringing it up, people will learn that just like the other factors we discuss, it influences many other things in our experience. Because our mood affects our perceptions as well, it can be said to alter the world we live in. In the words of Ludwig Wittgenstein, quote, "The world of those who are happy is different from the world of those who are not." End quote. How does mood affect our perception? The extreme case of negative mood, clinical depression, has been shown to alter how easily people perceive happy expressions, so more happiness is needed on a face for a depressed person to recognize it as happy. Therefore, they live in a world of sad people. This effect goes away as the depression abates, and its return is associated with a relapse in depression. It has also been shown that the depression weakens the detection of contrast, making the world appear more grey. And there is preliminary evidence that detection of ambient light is decreased as well, making the world a dimmer place. On the other hand, good mood has been shown to release inhibition, widening visual spatial attention, as well as enhancing access to remote associates, meaning they found more creative connections between words that are more distantly related. Somewhat related to mood, it has been shown that baseball players who are on a hitting streak see the ball as bigger, sometimes describing it as volleyball-sized. And this is another example of our perception of the outside world being shaped by our state of mind. The mood also affects perceived pain, with just a short induction of positive affect being enough to reduce the amount of pain perceived while at rest or during effort. In patients with chronic low back pain, with negative mood having the opposite effect, just watching a 15 to 30 minute humorous film was enough to show effect. This effect of mood on pain perception has also been shown to be separate from attention. At this point, it should be apparent that our perceptions of the outside world are far from objective. From holes in our visual field that get patched up to changing colors and distances and sizes, the world we see outside is greatly influenced by our inner state. I promised that there would be great benefit to be found in this information, but what is it? I will now tell you. Seeing the world as malleable is a great thing. Nothing needs to be negative or insurmountable. Those are just our perceptions, and they can be changed with conscious effort with cognitive reappraisal. When one understands that nothing is as solid and independent as it seems, one realizes how they can alter their experience endlessly with cognitive reappraisal, at which point one can just reappraise away all negative events and turn them into something positive. Also, now that you understand how your inner state influences what and how you see the outside world, you can start to think of the world as your mirror. If something seems painful or taxing or lacking color, instead of blaming the outside world, consider using mindfulness, your inner state. You might just notice that you've grown stressed out when you weren't paying attention, or there is something causing you to feel blue. This way, you can use the outside world as a measure of your inner state and react accordingly. I have found this practice to be immensely powerful in my own life, and I hope you grasp my meaning and learn to use it as well. My original plan for this episode was to include all sides of perception, from the way we perceive ourselves to our perception of the outside world, how to improve our senses, perception of thoughts, and so on. But once again, I have underestimated how much time it would take to put an episode of that size and length together. I aim to publish an episode a week, so in the future I will have to plan the contents of these episodes more thoroughly and plan and delimit what subjects I will discuss more completely. So I will be dividing the subject of perceptions into multiple episodes as well. And the rest of this episode will focus more on what kind of inner factors shape our perceptions of the outside world, with the aim to make us question our held beliefs. Do they cause us to live in a darker, more negative world? Are we, because we are mindless, making our world a more stressful, unpleasant place? In my opinion, such beliefs are maladaptive, and developing better ones should be strongly considered. The topic of political polarization has been in the media a lot in the recent years, so let us look how political partisanship influences our perception. The foundation of this effect lies in how we tend to see our own group more favorably than a group we consider to be others. For example, a classic study in this field showed a football match to students of the two competing schools. Their views of the game differed so widely it was like they had witnessed a different game. One does not even have to be a long-time member of a particular group. In one study, people were separated into red and blue teams, and they already perceived the hand movements of their own team as faster as the other teams, showing that the group we mentally consider ourselves to be part of, even if it is this arbitrary, influences our perception of the actions of other people. This might be because we are wired to mirror the actions of others and those in the same group as us more strongly, which might explain why the subjects perceive the movements of their own group as faster. In another study, it was shown that when people who could be divided into right-wing and left-wing supporters processed political videos differently depending on whether the content was right or left-wing, many different areas of the brain activated differently depending on party affiliation, but these areas included the somatosensory regions, suggesting that there might have been a difference in the way the political speeches were perceived. The authors suggest this might have also been because of differences in attention. Another hypothesis they put out is that through embodiment, the subjects may have been mimicking the speakers and therefore identified with them more strongly. Another study showed that simply having a disclosure of political affiliation, right or left wing, next to one's picture is enough to change how the face is perceived. People with opposing view are considered more threatening, while those with same affiliation are regarded more favorably. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it also became apparent that people with different political leanings perceive the associated risks differently, and this is not just a feeling or an estimation, but something that has been shown in at least one study. Political partisanship has even been shown to influence how one perceives the skin tone of a biracial candidate. People were given pictures of the same candidate or Barack Obama where the skin tone was changed to be either lighter or darker. Those who matched the partisanship of the candidate judged the lighter skinned images to be representative of the candidate, and those who did not match the partisanship judged the artificially darkened images to be closer to the truth. Also, people who planned to vote for Obama considered the lighter-skinned images of him to be more accurate, while those who were planning to not vote for him considered the darkened images more realistic. So the mental image of him they had different based on their voting intentions. Extreme example of politically motivated behavior is political violence and terrorism for political reasons. One of the reasons behind people becoming radicalized to the point of committing violence, even suicide bombing, according to the literature, is perceived unfairness. This perception can be biased, so even relatively well-off individuals may show extreme levels of grievance and resentment. Another perception-related aspect that has been linked to radicalization includes perceived moral superiority, perceived injustice done to one's group, and this last perception can last over multiple generations. Furthermore, at the workplace, perceived unfairness has been shown to relate to worse physical and mental health. These last, more controversial and darker examples show what drastic and dangerous effects our perceptions can have. In these cases, we have an understanding of the world that causes us to perceive it in a way that generates negative emotions in us. For example, if we did not hold a view on what is fair, we would not perceive unfairness, since unfairness cannot exist without fairness. It is our expectation that causes us to perceive things in this way. Does this mean we should forget about all fairness and let ourselves and our loved ones get pushed around and be abused? Of course not, but a better and more mindful way to stop the ill treatment needs to be found. We can fight against injustice without all these negative perceptions. Like Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. When you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you. The idea I introduced earlier on how the world we perceive is a reflection of our inner state can also be used here. When we think ourselves the victims of some kind of mistreatment, instead of thinking what is wrong with the person or the system that we perceive as mistreating us, we should look into ourselves and try to find out what is wrong in us for us to perceive the world in such a negative light. Could we see the mistreatment as motivation to improve ourselves? If it is harsh words, could we not just let them wash over us? If we feel the whole system is against us, is that thought really realistic? Or is our view on the world twisted? If we look for the problems from the wrong direction, the outside world, we will never be able to stop the unfairness and injustice we perceive as long as the perception is born from factors within ourselves. Once this is understood, one can reshape their own subjective world, removing injustice from it, without having to resort to any drastic outside measures. This topic would deserve a lot more discussion, and I can return to it in a later episode. But my goal is to publish this episode today, and there are only 50 minutes to midnight left as I record this episode. A deadline looms, even when it is a self-dictated one, so I will have to finish up this episode so I can get to editing it and so on. To summarize, in this episode we discussed how our perceptions are not objective representations of the world, but highly subjective creations influenced by a variety of things, from mood to our physical state, to which group of people we identify with. I further limited the discussion to focus on our perceptions of the outside world and how our inner variables change those perceptions. Part 2 on perceptions, sometime in the future, will focus more on perceptions of ourselves and our inner sensations, but I think I will also add some more perceptions of the outside world to that episode, as I find their subjectivity and malleability very interesting. The next episode I have in mind is about mental objects, by which I primarily mean thoughts and imaginations, and I think I will focus on the latter. We will discuss how we can use our imagination for our benefit and improvement, and if I manage my time better than in this episode, we might have the chance to discuss magic. And I'm not talking about a guy doing card tricks. I'm talking about traditions where people have used the power of their mind to create some effect on themselves, and how you can do the same. Don't believe me? Listen to the next episode of Mindset Thoughts and decide for yourself. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Mindset Thoughts. I hope you found it informative and the lessons and practices spoken in it relevant to your situation. I also hope you found it as entertaining to listen as I found making it to be. If you found it beneficial, be sure to follow Mindset Thoughts on Spotify as well as on YouTube, where you can also give us a thumbs up. Also, make sure to check out our Discord server for further discussion, where you can contact me directly. Links in description and channel information. There you can also find the link to my book, which I have self-published on Amazon, called Death Drive. If speculative dystopian near-future sci-fi sounds like a cup of tea, getting the book is a great way to support my work as an author. So have a nice day, and memento cerebrum formare.